He had paid for a service, for silence, for discretion, for distance. But on that particular afternoon, he found something else entirely. A forbidden sound in a sanctuary of grief, a flicker of movement where only stillness should reign. He witnessed a stranger's audacity, daring to touch what was intimately his. The verdict was swift, cold as the marble under his shoes. What he didn't know was that his own judgment was the blindfold, and the truth was about to collect its due. Julian Croft's mansion, perched at the city's highest point, wasn't a home. It was a fortress of glass and steel. Inside, time was measured by the hum of the central air and the solitary echo of Julian's dress shoes on imported marble. He was a man who had built an empire on the ashes of tragedy, a billionaire whose only language of affection was the rising balance in his accounts. His love was real, but it was buried beneath layers of board meetings and bottom lines. Across the vast living room, seated in her wheelchair, was Claire. At 17, her world was framed by a floor-to-ceiling window, showcasing a world in motion, while she remained perfectly still. Since the accident that had stolen her mobility and her mother's life, Claire's joy had become a relic, something her father tried to shield with security and luxury, but never with his presence. It was into this cold tableau that Samuel arrived. The new driver, a man with broad shoulders and a quiet strength that seemed impervious to the opulence around him. As his eyes swept the room, they didn't linger on the priceless paintings or the award-winning design. They saw the girl in the window. He gave a reserved nod, a gesture of professional respect, but his gaze held no pity. It held something deeper, an almost imperceptible recognition. In that instant, a new energy, silent and unpredictable, had entered the house. As the weeks passed, a sterile routine solidified. Julian dictated the day's agenda through texts and emails, a general commanding his fortress from afar. To him, love was a logistical equation. The best doctors, the perfect diet, flawless security. He protected Claire's life, but had forgotten how to nourish it. The household staff, conditioned for invisibility, performed their duties with cold precision, treating Claire with the care reserved for a valuable, fragile piece of art. In this aseptic world, Samuel was an anomaly. He didn't speak much, but he listened with his entire being. His primary duty was to drive Claire to her physical therapy sessions, trips marked by a silence that, with him, wasn't awkward, but respectful. One afternoon, on the way home, traffic stalled them on an overpass. The sky ignited in shades of pink and orange, a spectacle the car window only allowed in fragments. Claire craned her neck, trying to absorb the scene. Samuel noticed her straining in the reflection. Without a word, he reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror, angling it not for the road behind, but for her. Suddenly, the entire sunset was hers, a living masterpiece captured in a small rectangle. A tiny, almost secret smile touched Claire's lips. In a house where everyone was paid to serve, but not to see, someone had finally seen her. The seed of connection Samuel had planted began to sprout. The car rides gained a soundtrack from an old radio station that played songs from Claire's childhood. He never asked invasive questions, but instead narrated the world to her. He'd point out a bird's nest on a telephone pole, a new piece of graffiti on a wall, small bits of beauty hidden in the concrete jungle she had only ever seen as a blur. And for the first time in a long time, Claire didn't just feel transported. She felt present. One rainy afternoon, Julian's meeting was cancelled, and he came home unannounced. The sound of his shoes was muffled by the front door opening at the exact moment Samuel wheeled Claire inside. Samuel was quietly telling her about a stray cat that always hid under his car on rainy days. The story was trivial, but he told it with such unexpected tenderness that Claire let out a laugh. Not a smile, but a genuine, crystal-clear laugh. A sound that hadn't echoed in that hall for years. Julian froze. A normal father would have felt a warmth in his chest, But Julian felt a cold spike of possession. That joy hadn't been bought by him, hadn't been prescribed by one of his doctors. It was contraband. His eyes locked on Samuel, completely ignoring his daughter. "Your shift is over," he said. The voice was neutral, but the message was a blade. Claire's laughter died in the air, the light in her eyes extinguished. The warning had been issued. In this house, happiness was by appointment only. The forced peace was short-lived. Julian's order hung in the air, and the mansion became a mausoleum once more. Samuel grew more distant, professional to a fault. Claire retreated behind her eyes again, and silence won. But the memory of that connection was an ember that refused to be smothered. One night, Julian returned from a business trip a day early. The house was dark, still, just how he liked it. But then he heard it, drifting from the living room, a whisper of piano music, so faint it was almost imaginary. He walked on tiptoe, suspicion mounting with each step, and then he saw the scene that would be burned into his mind. In the dim glow of a single lamp, Samuel wasn't just with Claire. He was holding her hands, and in slow, careful steps he was dancing with her. He moved his own body, guiding her wheelchair in a gentle sway, a silent, tender ballet. Claire's head was tilted back, her eyes were closed, and on her face was an expression of pure bliss, a complete surrender to the movement her own body could no longer create. In that moment, she wasn't a patient, she was free. To Julian, this wasn't a dance, it was a violation. The intimacy, the music, the smile on his daughter's face that he couldn't conjure. It was the final affront. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice sliced through the music. Claire's body went rigid, her eyes flying open in shock. The dream was over. Samuel stopped instantly, the serenity on his face finally cracking, replaced by a deep hurt. "Sir, I was just—" "You were overstepping," Julian interrupted, his voice low and lethal. "Get your things. I don't want to see you in my house again, ever. You're fired." "Dad, please," Claire pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "You don't understand." But Julian wasn't listening. He only saw the breach of his authority. Samuel looked at Claire, a look that apologized for a joy that had become a crime. And without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind the sound of weeping and a silence heavier than any wall. Samuel's dismissal didn't bring the order Julian expected. On the contrary, it unleashed a new kind of silence, one that was heavy with the texture of accusation. Claire transformed. She no longer cried, no longer argued. She simply withdrew to a place inside herself her father couldn't reach. She moved through her routines with the precision of an automaton. Eating without tasting, going to physical therapy with a new therapist who dared not tell stories, and spending hours staring out the window, no longer with melancholy but with a terrifying indifference. It was a silent protest, and it was her most devastating weapon. Julian tried to fight back with the only tools he knew. He bought her gifts, the latest gadgets, planned renovations for her room. He tried to fill the void with things, but his daughter's soul was not for sale. With every refused gift, every empty stare she gave him, Julian's certainty began to crumble. The image that haunted him was no longer one of disrespect, but of Claire's face, rapturous, during the dance. Her joy had become a ghost in his own home. One sleepless night, he broke one of his own rules and entered his daughter's room. She was asleep, and in the quiet, he felt like an intruder. On her nightstand, a notebook he'd given her lay open. He moved closer, his heart heavy. It wasn't a diary, but on the last page, he saw it. There was a clumsy drawing of two figures, one in a wheelchair, spinning. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence in shaky handwriting. "Today I danced." He calls it the soul dance. He says it's so the soul can remember how to be free. I closed my eyes, and I didn't feel the chair anymore. For the first time, I felt whole. The word whole hit Julian like a physical blow. He hadn't fired an employee for breaking a rule. He had evicted the only person who had managed to piece his daughter back together. There, In the dim light of the bedroom, surrounded by a luxury that had never felt so pointless, the powerful Julian Croft finally crumbled, confronted by the scale of his mistake and the depth of his own foolishness. With the page from Claire's notebook burning in his mind, Julian mobilized his resources. But this time, it wasn't for a corporate acquisition. It was a rescue mission. Finding Samuel wasn't easy. He was an ordinary man, a face in the crowd, without the digital footprint of an executive. The search led Julian far from the wide avenues and mirrored skyscrapers to a modest neighborhood, to the door of a community center that smelled of fresh paint and brewing coffee. The place pulsed with a life his mansion had never known, and in the back patio, beneath a sprawling oak tree, there he was. Samuel. No longer in a stiff uniform but in a simple t-shirt, he was at the center of a small group. Children and teens, some in wheelchairs, others with different challenges, all of them focused on him. With a small radio playing a soft melody, Samuel guided them through movements. He helped one boy stretch his arms like wings, encouraged a girl to sway her head to the rhythm, led another in his chair in a small spin that made him beam. This wasn't a secret he was hiding. This was who he was. Julian stood at the entrance, a strange figure in his expensive suit. Samuel saw him. Their eyes met over the heads of the children. There was no shock on Samuel's face, no anger, just a calm that disarmed Julian completely. He excused himself to an assistant and walked toward his former employer. All of Julian's authority, all his power, evaporated under that gaze. The billionaire was now the beggar. The fired driver was the man who held everything he needed. "Samuel," Julian began, his voice softer than he intended. He swallowed hard. I read what she wrote about the soul dance." He paused, the confession hanging in the air. "I had no idea. I was blind." It wasn't yet an apology. It was a surrender, the capitulation of a king before the truth. Samuel simply listened, his serene face holding the weight of a long history. Facing Julian's confession, Samuel took a deep breath, as if drawing strength from a faraway place. "The soul dance wasn't my invention, sir," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "It belonged to my wife, Helen. She was a physical therapist, and she used to say the real prison isn't the chair, it's forgetting. Forgetting what your soul feels like when it's free." Samuel's eyes drifted for a moment. She passed a few years ago, before she could turn her therapy into something bigger. "When I saw your daughter staring out that window, I saw the same thirst, the same soul asking for music." He looked directly at Julian. "I didn't mean to disrespect you, sir. I only wanted to honor my wife's memory by offering the gift she left behind." The revelation struck Julian with the force of a wave. Two men from entirely different worlds, both trying to navigate the grief of losing their wives. One built walls of money, the other built bridges of memory and music. Shame burned Julian's pride to ash. His eyes welled up for the first time in years. Her mother, Caroline, she loved to dance, he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Samuel, stripped of all his arrogance, and made the humblest request of his life. Can you teach me, please, teach me how to dance with my daughter?" In that instant, there was no billionaire and no driver, just a father asking another man to teach him the forgotten language of the heart. So often, we build our lives like a fortress, with high walls to protect ourselves from pain. But we forget that those same walls are what isolate us from healing. Julian owned an empire but lived in a gilded cage, measuring love in dollar signs and safety in protocols. He looked at Samuel and saw a uniform, a function, a risk. He didn't see a man carrying a love so profound it spilled over as care for others. Their story teaches us that pride is the cruelest form of blindness, and prejudice, the most expensive kind of ignorance. It took the quiet dignity of a man who had lost almost everything to teach a man who thought he had everything what truly matters. It was never about a dance performed with the feet, but about the movement of the soul, about how sometimes the deepest connections are born not from shared joy, but from a pain recognized in another's eyes. In the end, Julian's true wealth wasn't in his bank account, but in the courage to ask for help and the humility to learn the lesson. If this story moved you in any way, your like is our silent applause and shows us we're on the right path. Tell me here in the comments what city you're watching from. I make a point to read every single one and reply with all my heart. And if you believe in the power of stories that transform us, subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Every subscription is the fuel that allows us to continue this journey. Don't go just yet. Choose one of the 2 stories I've left on the screen for you. I'll see you in the next video.